Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. This time, we're going to be looking at the state of student migration to Australia. There's a ton of debate about migration,
Oh, yeah.
but we're going to kind of go beyond just like the political stuff and like really look at what's going on. We're using this article called Migration Target Not a Chance as students keep coming. So the big question is, are Australia's migration goals even like achievable?
Definitely big question.
So right away, you see these headlines like almost 40,000 international students came to Australia in October. 39,270 to be exact.
Wow.
Yeah, and that sounds like a lot, right? But it's actually lower than the numbers we saw before the pandemic hit. So back in October 2019, over 50,000 international students arrived. So is this really a huge surge, or are we just kind of going back to a familiar pattern?
Yeah, I think it raises the question of where are all these students coming from? Like, is it the same countries as before the pandemic, or has there been a shift? That would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, for sure. Now let's talk about what the government's actually hoping to do with its migration goals. They're trying to reduce net migration. And just so everyone's on the same page, when we say net migration, we mean like the difference between how many people are moving to Australia and how many people are leaving. So the government's saying they want to take that number from 548,000 in the year that ended in September 2023, all the way down to 260,000 by June 2025. That's a pretty big drop.
That is ambitious.
And there are already some people who are like, I don't think that's going to happen. Like this migration expert, Abul Rizvi. He says the target's probably not realistic. And he's pointing out that net migration is already like 100,000 people higher than it should be, just given like where we are in the year right now.
Right.
So is the government's math just like completely off? Or are there just some things they haven't really thought about yet?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's this thing called the lag effect. So basically, new visa applications might be down, but you still have a bunch of students who are coming in on visas that were already approved, like
Right.
before the government put in all these new restrictions.
So it's like we're still feeling the impact of decisions made like a while ago.
Exactly.
So how long do you think that lag effect's going to last? And I mean, does that make it even harder to figure out what migration numbers are going to look like in the future?
Yeah, predicting those numbers is always tricky. The lag effect just like adds another layer of complexity on top of everything else. It's really hard to say for sure how long it'll last. Plus, we also have to think about the fact that students are staying in Australia longer than they used to. Like, we've got a record number of temporary graduate work visas being handed out. In October alone, there were over 224,000 of them.
Wow. So not only are new students coming in, but the ones who are already here are staying for longer.
Exactly.
So what's causing that? Is it like the job market in Australia? Maybe the lifestyle? Or is it just harder to get visas for other places now?
I think it's probably a mix of all those things. Australia is a pretty attractive place to be, that's for sure. But there's also the fact that a lot of students who finish their courses here are applying for even more student visas. And even if those applications get rejected, a lot of them appeal the decision. So that extends their time here even more.
So you've got the pull of like wanting to stay in Australia,
Yeah,
but you've also got this push from maybe not having many other options.
right.
Okay, but we can't just ignore the political side of this whole thing, right? Like you've got the coalition and the Greens, and they made this deal that's impacting student caps. And then there's this whole Ministerial Direction 107 system.
Yeah, what is that?
Can you explain that one?
Basically, it's a way of prioritizing certain types of visas. So it's kind of like adding yet another layer of complexity to the whole visa application process.
It sounds it's just trying to figure out the visa system is getting harder and harder for students.
Yeah, definitely.
And speaking of politics, Peter Dutton, who's the leader of the coalition, it seems like he's kind of backing away from what he said before about limiting net migration to 160,000. If his party wins the next election, now he's saying they're not going to decide anything until after the election, which is in May 2025. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it just shows how tricky this whole thing is. It's like this balancing act between what the government wants to do, the economic side of things, and then the political side of things. You've got businesses that need workers, especially in certain industries. But then you've got people who are worried about the impact of migration on wages and jobs for Australian citizens. And then, of course, you've got the whole housing affordability issue.
Right, because that's a big one. We're always hearing about rents and property prices going up,
Mm.
especially in the big cities. So how much do you think that's playing into the whole migration debate?
Oh, I think it's a huge factor. People are really worried about it when more people come in, including students. It puts even more pressure on the housing market, which is already struggling.
All right, so it's like this domino effect.
Mm.
More people means higher demand for housing.
Yeah.
That pushes prices up. And then it just gets harder for everyone to find a place they can
Yeah,
afford.
exactly.
And that probably makes people even more anxious about migration and fuels those political debates.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But is it really just about managing migration? Or are there other things going on that are making it so hard to find affordable housing?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It's definitely not a simple issue.
No, it's really complicated. Migration plays a role, but it's not the whole story. You've got things like zoning regulations, how people are investing in property, and whether enough new homes are being built.
So maybe just focusing on migration numbers is kind of oversimplifying the problem.
Yeah, I think so.
It's interesting, though, because there's also this idea of attracting the right kind of migrants, people with skills that Australia needs.
Right.
So where do student visas fit into all of this?
Well, student migration is a big part of how Australia gets skilled workers. A lot of these students end up staying here after they graduate. And then they use those skills to contribute to the economy. So it's not just about them getting an education here, it's about potentially building a workforce for the future.
So the government's trying to do two things at once. They want to reduce overall migration, but they also want to attract people with specific skills.
Right.
That sounds pretty difficult to pull off. I mean, are we striking the right balance?
Yeah, are we sending mixed messages to people who might be thinking about studying in Australia?
And ultimately, what does this mean for Australia's future?
These are the big questions we need to be asking. We need to look beyond just what's happening right now and think about the long-term consequences. What kind of society are we creating? What's the impact of all of this on our culture and our social fabric?
Yeah, because we've talked a lot about the numbers and the policies, but it's important to remember the human element here. These are real people with their own hopes and dreams and challenges.
Absolutely.
We can't forget that behind every data point is a person who's making big life decisions.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture, like all the policies and the economic predictions and all that. But at the end of the day, this is about people. These students are coming here to chase their dreams, they're taking risks, and they're hoping for a better future.
It really is pretty incredible when you think about it. These students are investing in their education here in Australia. They're leaving their homes and their families, their comfort zones. To come to a totally different part of the world, that takes a lot of courage.
It does. And they're bringing all these different perspectives and experiences with them. They're adding all these new ideas and energy to our society. It's really enriching our culture.
Like adding all these vibrant colors to a tapestry.
Exactly. And that's something we should be celebrating, even while we're trying to figure out how to manage migration. We can't lose sight of all the good things these students bring to Australia, not just to the economy, but to like the whole fabric of our society.
You mentioned the economy. A lot of international students end up staying here after they graduate,
Yeah.
and then they use their skills in the workforce. So it's not just about them getting an education. It's about potentially building up our workforce for the future.
Right. And that's what makes the government's attempts to tighten up the visa rules so interesting. On one hand, they're trying to reduce the total number of migrants. But on the other hand, they're also trying to attract specific types of migrants, the ones who have the skills we need and can help the economy grow.
So doesn't that send kind of a mixed message to potential students? It seems like the government's trying to walk a really fine line. Are we making it harder for talented people to come here and contribute to Australia?
It's a good question. And yeah, there are concerns about whether we're striking the right balance. Are we discouraging skilled people from choosing Australia for their education and their careers?
And then, of course, there's the whole housing affordability crisis. It's
Yeah.
hard to talk about migration without talking about how more people put pressure on the housing market.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It doesn't matter if it's students or other types of migrants. When more people come in, the demand for housing goes up, especially in those big cities. And that can drive prices up and make it harder for everyone to find somewhere they can afford to live.
So the question is managing migration the answer to the housing problem? Or are there other things going on that are contributing to it?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It's definitely a hot topic in politics right now.
Yeah, it is. It's a really complex issue with no easy answers. Migration is definitely part of it, but it's not the only thing. We have to think about zoning regulations, how people are investing in property,
Yeah.
and how quickly new homes are being built.
So it's not as simple as just saying, let's reduce migration, that'll fix the housing problem.
Exactly.
Some people say that students are taking advantage of the visa system, like finding loopholes to stay longer, and that's adding to the pressure on housing.
What do you think about that?
Well, there are always going to be people who try to game the system. But I think it's important to remember that most international students are genuinely here to study, and they want to contribute to Australia in a positive way. It's not fair to stereotype a whole group of people based on the actions of a few.
It's about looking at the bigger picture and understanding all the different sides of the story.
Exactly. And that's what we're trying to do with this deep dive. We want to go beyond just the headlines and the sound bites and really explore the complexities of student migration to Australia.
Yeah, we've looked at the data, we've talked about the policies, and we've even touched on the politics of it all. But we've also tried to keep the focus on the people involved
Right, because these aren't just statistics we're talking about. These are real people's lives, their hopes and their dreams.
and the contributions they're making to Australia's diverse culture.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to think about this. How do you see this flow of students from all over the world impacting Australia's future? Not just the economic future, but the cultural and social future too. What kind of Australia are we building for the future? Yeah, it really is a question with so many different angles, isn't it?
Right.
Like, we've seen student migration is complicated. It has a lot of different implications. It's not just about numbers and policies. It's about people and what they're hoping for
Hmm.
and the choices they make
Hmm.
and how all of that impacts the future of Australia.
It really does touch on so many different parts of Australian society, like the economy, the housing market, our culture, and even our national identity.
And throughout this whole deep dive, I think what's been most important is remembering that human element. We're not just tossing around statistics. These are real stories about real people.
And those stories are all so different. You've got students coming here to learn specific skills and knowledge that they'll take back home. You've got students who want to build a whole new life for themselves here in Australia and share their talents and perspectives. And then you have students who are maybe somewhere in between. They're still figuring things out and seeing where life takes them.
It makes you wonder, what are their dreams? What are their ambitions? What are the challenges they face when they get here? What's it like for them to adjust to a new culture, a new education system, a whole new way of life?
Those are all such important questions. And I think they highlight how important it is to be empathetic and understanding whenever we talk about migration. It's easy to get caught up in the big abstract debates about numbers and policies. But we can't forget that behind every single data point is a human being with their own unique story.
And a lot of times those stories don't get told. We hear a lot about the economic impact of student migration, the skills they bring, how they contribute to the workforce. But we don't often hear about their personal journeys, their struggles, their successes, the ways they make our communities richer and more vibrant.
And that's something we really need to change. We need to make sure those voices are heard so we can have a more well-rounded and informed conversation about student migration.
I think if you're listening to this deep dive and you're thinking, okay, this is all interesting, but what does it actually mean for me? Here's something to consider. This whole global flow of students isn't just shaping Australia's future, it's shaping your future too.
That's so true. Whether it's the kinds of jobs that are available, the diversity of your community, or even the kinds of conversations you have at home, student migration is affecting your life in ways you might not even realize.
So what can you do? First, stay informed. Don't just rely on headlines and sound bites. Look for different perspectives. Read stories from students themselves. Talk to people who have different opinions. Challenge your own assumptions.
And remember, this isn't just some theoretical thing. We're talking about real people's lives. So approach this issue with empathy, with curiosity. Be open to learning and understanding.
Because at the end of the day, the choices we make as a society, the policies we support, the conversations we have, all of that will determine what kind of Australia we create, not just for ourselves, but for future generations.
That's a really powerful point. And it brings us right back to the question we started with. Are Australia's migration goals achievable? Maybe the answer isn't just about numbers and targets. Maybe it's about how we as a society decide to approach this whole complex and constantly changing situation.
That's a great point. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We hope it's given you some things to think about, maybe sparked your curiosity, and maybe even challenged some of your perspectives. We'll be back again soon with another fascinating topic to explore.